The gleaming silver Mercedes-Benz rolled to a sputtering halt at the edge of a bustling, modest neighborhood on the city's east side. Emily Peterson tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her manicured nails digging into the leather. She glanced around, her perfectly arched brows furrowing as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. The small brick buildings, colorful murals, and rows of mom-and-pop shops were a world apart from the marble fountains and designer boutiques she frequented. "This can't be happening," she muttered, her voice laced with irritation. The digital dashboard confirmed her worst fear, a total engine failure. She reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number for her assistant. The call went straight to voicemail.
Ugh.
Useless, Emily hissed, tossing her phone onto the passenger seat. As if on cue, her gaze landed on a small sign across the street, Johnson's Auto Repair. With a deep sigh, she stepped out of the car, her stiletto heels clicking against the cracked pavement. The air smelled faintly of motor oil and street food, a far cry from the jasmine-scented hallways of her estate. The shop door jingled as she entered, and her eyes immediately narrowed at the sight before her. The garage was a maze of tools, spare parts, and grease-stained floors. A man stood hunched over an engine, his back turned to her. He wore a simple navy work shirt with Marcus embroidered in white thread. "You there," Emily called, her tone sharp enough to slice steel. "I need someone to fix my car. It's parked right outside. It's a Mercedes, so I expect it to be handled with care." The man straightened slowly, turning to face her. Marcus Johnson was tall, with broad shoulders and an air of quiet confidence. His hands were smudged with grease, but his eyes were calm and steady. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said politely, wiping his hands on a rag. "What seems to be the problem?" Emily crossed her arms, looking him up and down. "The problem," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "is that my very expensive car decided to break down in this place. Can you even handle a car like mine? Or should I call someone more qualified?" Marcus's expression didn't waver. "We work on all kinds of vehicles here, including Mercedes. If you give me the keys, I'll take a look." Her lips pursed in disapproval, but she fished the key fob out of her Hermes handbag and handed it to him.
Fine.
"But I need this done quickly. I have an important event tonight, and I don't intend to be late because of delays." Marcus nodded, walking past her toward the car. Emily followed, her heels clicking impatiently against the pavement. "You know," she said, trailing behind him, "it's surprising to find a place like this in a neighborhood like this. I mean, I suppose it's functional, but hardly the kind of establishment I'm used to." Marcus opened the hood, seemingly unfazed by her commentary. "We focus on getting the job done, ma'am. A fancy shop doesn't fix engines." Emily rolled her eyes. "Yes, I suppose that's true. Still, appearances matter, don't you think?" Marcus didn't answer immediately, instead examining the engine with meticulous care. After a moment, he spoke. "Looks like a problem with your fuel injection system. I can have it fixed by tomorrow afternoon." "Tomorrow?" Emily's voice rose in disbelief. "That's unacceptable. I need it done today." He glanced at her, his calm demeanor unwavering. "It's a complex repair. Rushing it might cause more damage. I'd recommend patience." "Patience?" Emily let out a short laugh. "I'm not paying for patience. I'm paying for results. Do you even understand what kind of car you're dealing with?" Marcus set down his tools and looked her directly in the eye. His tone remained respectful, but there was an edge of firmness in his words. "I understand exactly what kind of car it is, and I understand what it takes to fix it. If you'd rather take it somewhere else, that's your choice." Emily stared at him, momentarily speechless. She wasn't accustomed to being spoken to so plainly, especially by someone she considered beneath her. "Fine," she snapped, spinning on her heel. "Do whatever you have to do. Just make sure it's ready by tomorrow. And I expect it to be spotless." Marcus nodded once, then turned back to the engine. The next morning, Emily returned to the shop, her expression a mixture of impatience and irritation. The car was parked out front, looking as pristine as ever. Marcus stood nearby, wiping his hands on a clean rag. "Is it ready?" she demanded. "It's ready," Marcus said, his tone as steady as the day before. I replaced the faulty parts and ran a diagnostic to make sure everything's in order. Emily reached for her keys, but Marcus held them just out of reach. Before you go, he said, there's something you should know. Her brow furrowed. What is it now? Marcus nodded toward the building across the street. That's Johnson Motors, the dealership I own. This shop is just one part of what I do. I like to stay connected to where I started. Emily blinked, her perfectly painted lips parting in surprise. She turned to look at the dealership, its sleek glass facade and polished logo suddenly seeming out of place in the neighborhood. You're the owner? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I am, Marcus replied simply. Emily's cheeks flushed a deep shade of crimson. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in her life, she was at a loss. Emily sat in the driver's seat of her Mercedes, her manicured fingers gripping the steering wheel as tightly as her ego tried to grip the remnants of her composure. She glanced at the dealership across the street, Johnson Motors, its gold lettering shining like a cruel joke. She took a deep breath, stepped out of the car, and marched back toward the small garage. Her heels struck the pavement with a rhythm that screamed indignation. Marcus was leaning against a workbench, speaking calmly to another mechanic when she entered. He straightened as she approached, his expression neutral but alert. Mr. Johnson, she began, her voice struggling to maintain its usual commanding tone, I'd like to understand why someone who owns a dealership like that is working in this. She waved a hand toward the modest surroundings, her disdain impossible to miss. Marcus set down the wrench he was holding and crossed his arms. I told you yesterday, I like staying connected to where I started.
This shop is important to me.
It's not about appearances. It's about substance. Emily narrowed her eyes. Substance? Don't you think your time would be better spent managing your business instead of, she gestured vaguely, playing with tools in the back of a shop? Marcus chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to unnerve her more than any harsh retort. Playing with tools? That's one way to put it. But let me ask you something, Ms. Peterson. Do you think running a business means forgetting the skills that got you there? I don't see the relevance, Emily snapped, folding her arms. The relevance, Marcus said, his tone steady, is that leadership isn't about sitting in an office and delegating. It's about understanding every part of the job, whether it's negotiating a deal in a boardroom or fixing an engine in a garage. You might call it playing. I call it staying grounded. Emily felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She hated the way his calm confidence made her feel small. Well, you certainly have an interesting philosophy, she said, her words laced with sarcasm. But it's hardly the way things are done in more sophisticated circles. Marcus tilted his head, studying her for a moment. Sophisticated circles? You mean places where people are judged by their money instead of their character? Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. For the first time, she felt the sharp edge of her own arrogance being turned against her. The sound of the shop door jingling interrupted the tense silence. A young woman walked in, holding the hand of a little boy. She smiled warmly at Marcus. Hey, Marcus. I just wanted to drop off those cookies my mom baked for you, the woman said, setting a neatly wrapped package on the counter. Thanks, Gina, Marcus replied, his demeanor softening. He crouched down to the boy's level, ruffling his hair. How's school, champs? Good, the boy beamed. I got an A on my math test. That's what I like to hear, Marcus said, giving the boy a fist bump. Emily stood off to the side, watching the interaction with an odd mix of confusion and discomfort. This wasn't the kind of scene she was used to. In her world, interactions were transactional, polite but distant. This warmth, this genuine connection felt foreign. Gina glanced at Emily, her smile faltering slightly. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Marcus straightened and waved off her concern. You're not interrupting at all. This is Ms. Peterson. She's just picking up her car. Emily forced a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. Charmed, she said curtly. Gina nodded politely before turning back to Marcus. We'll let you get back to work. Thanks again for everything, Marcus. As they left, Emily turned to him, her expression a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. What was that about? That was Gina and her son, Leo, Marcus said simply. Her car broke down last month, and she couldn't afford the repairs. So, we helped her out. You gave her free service? Emily asked, incredulous. Marcus shrugged. Sometimes people need a hand. This neighborhood's been good to me. I try to give back where I can. Emily shook her head, disbelief written across her face. That's noble, I suppose. But it doesn't make business sense. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Not everything's about making money, Miss Peterson. Sometimes it's about doing what's right. As the conversation unfolded, Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, grateful for the distraction. The screen displayed a message from her assistant. Hope your car's ready. Don't forget your dinner reservation tonight with Mr. Goldstein. Important to secure the partnership for the gala. Emily sighed, suddenly reminded of the world she belonged to, a world where appearances were everything and partnerships were built over overpriced dinners and handshakes that didn't mean much. She glanced at Marcus, who had returned to organizing tools on the workbench. There was something unsettling about his calmness, his refusal to be rattled by her barbs. Why do you even bother with people like that? She asked suddenly, her voice tinged with frustration. Marcus paused and turned to her. People like what? Like that woman and her son. People who don't have anything to offer you? His expression hardened slightly, though his voice remained calm. Everyone has something to offer, Ms. Peterson. It might not be money or status, but kindness and gratitude go a long way. You'd be surprised how much richer your life becomes when you stop keeping score. Emily felt the sting of his words, though she refused to let it show. Well, she said, brushing invisible dust off her designer blazer, I guess we see the world differently. Marcus smiled faintly. That we do? As she got back into her car, Emily couldn't shake the weight of the conversation. Marcus's words lingered in her mind like an unwelcome guest, challenging the foundation of everything she believed. The polished leather interior of her Mercedes felt colder, lonelier. For the first time, Emily wondered if her world of luxury and power was as fulfilling as she had always told herself it was. But the thought was fleeting. She shook her head, dismissing it as quickly as it had come. After all, what did a mechanic know about her life? Still, as she drove away, the sight of Marcus standing in the doorway of the shop stayed with her. His calm demeanor, his unapologetic authenticity, it was infuriating and, somehow, impossible to ignore. The gala buzzed with the hum of polite conversation and the clink of crystal glasses. Emily stood near a lavishly decorated table, a flute of champagne in her hand. Her emerald green gown, custom-made by a Parisian designer, shimmered under the grand chandelier that bathed the room in warm light. Around her, the city's elite exchanged pleasantries, their laughter punctuating the soft melody of a string quartet. But Emily wasn't laughing. She was scanning the room, her polished exterior masking the turmoil within. Marcus's words from earlier still echoed in her mind, disrupting her usual confidence. Emily. A familiar voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to see Richard Goldstein, a key benefactor for the gala's charity initiative. He was a heavy-set man with a booming voice and an air of self-importance. Richard, she said, forcing a smile. So glad you could make it. Richard laughed, his eyes scanning her appraisingly. Wouldn't miss it. I hear you've got some impressive plans for the Peterson Foundation this year. Of course, Emily replied smoothly. We're always looking to expand our reach. As they spoke, the doors to the ballroom opened, and a new wave of guests entered. Emily glanced toward the entrance, her breath catching in her throat. There, in a tailored suit that managed to look both understated and commanding, was Marcus Johnson. Her heart skipped a beat. He didn't belong here, not in this world of opulence and artifice. Yet, as he moved through the crowd with effortless composure, it was clear he didn't care about fitting in. Something wrong? Richard asked, noticing her distraction. Emily shook her head quickly. No, nothing at all. But it wasn't nothing. Marcus's presence was like a stone thrown into a still pond, creating ripples she couldn't ignore. Miss Peterson, Marcus greeted her an hour later, his voice calm as always. Emily turned, startled to find him standing behind her. Up close, the contrast between them was even more pronounced, her gleaming jewelry and designer gown against his simple but impeccable attire. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice dropping to a hushed whisper. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "This is a charity gala, isn't it?" "Johnson Motors is one of the sponsors." Her cheeks flushed. She hadn't realized his influence extended this far.
I
see. I just didn't expect to see you here." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that seemed to know more than he let on. "That's the thing about expectations, Miss Peterson. They're often misleading." Before she could respond, a waiter approached with a tray of champagne. Marcus politely declined, while Emily grabbed another flute, her fingers trembling slightly. As the evening wore on, Emily couldn't avoid him. It wasn't just his presence, it was the way people gravitated toward him. She watched as he spoke with CEOs, philanthropists, and even the mayor, each conversation marked by genuine engagement. It was infuriating. Finally, she found herself alone with him on the balcony, overlooking the city. The cool night air was a relief from the stifling atmosphere inside. "You certainly made an impression tonight," she said, her voice tinged with sarcasm. Marcus leaned against the railing, looking out at the city lights. "I'm not here to impress anyone." Emily rolled her eyes. "Of course not. You're just here to remind me how out of touch I am, right?" He turned to face her, his expression serious. "If you feel out of touch, that's on you, not me." Her jaw tightened. "You have no idea what it's like to live in my world. And you have no idea what it's like to live in mine," he replied evenly. The words hung between them, heavy and unyielding. For once, Emily didn't have a retort. Moments later, Richard joined them on the balcony, a wide smile on his face. "Marcus." "Good to see you," Richard said, shaking his hand with enthusiasm. "You two know each other?" Emily asked, startled. "Of course," Richard said. "Marcus's dealership has been one of our biggest donors for years." Emily's head spun. "Donors?" Marcus nodded. "Johnson Motors funds several initiatives, including scholarships for underprivileged students. We believe in investing in the future." Emily stared at him, the pieces slowly falling into place. She had spent so much time looking down on him, convinced of her superiority, only to realize that Marcus had been quietly achieving more meaningful impact than she ever had. Her throat tightened as the weight of her arrogance settled over her. I didn't know," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Marcus's gaze softened, but he didn't let her off the hook. "You didn't want to know." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. By the time Emily returned to her car, she felt like a stranger to herself. The familiar leather seats and sleek dashboard offered no comfort. The next morning, she found herself back at Johnson's Auto Repair. Marcus was in the middle of helping a customer when he noticed her standing awkwardly by the door. "Miss Peterson," he said, approaching her. "What brings you back?" She took a deep breath, her hands clutching the straps of her purse. "I owe you an apology." Marcus tilted his head, waiting. "I was wrong about you," she admitted. The words tasted foreign, but she forced them out. "About everything. I judged you without knowing anything about you." Marcus didn't speak immediately, letting her discomfort linger. Finally, he said, "And what made you change your mind?" Her cheeks flushed. "Seeing you at the gala. Hearing about what you've done. I realized that I've been shallow, arrogant." He nodded slowly. "It takes courage to admit that." Emily looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Do you think it's possible to change? To really become a better person?" Marcus's expression softened. "Change isn't about words, Miss Peterson. It's about actions. It's about doing the work, even when it's hard." She nodded, a small but genuine smile forming. "Thank you for everything." As she left the shop, Emily felt lighter, as if shedding years of self-imposed expectations. For the first time, she wasn't afraid to look at the world through a different lens. Marcus watched her go, a faint smile playing at his lips. He wasn't sure if she would truly change, but for now, she had taken the first step, and sometimes that was enough. Emily's mornings were usually an orchestrated symphony of efficiency. Her housekeeper would lay out her clothes, her assistant would confirm her schedule, and her driver would ensure her punctual arrival. But this morning was different. She sat at her dining table, untouched coffee growing cold in her delicate china cup. Her phone buzzed with notifications, emails, reminders, texts, but she ignored them, staring instead at the business card sitting in front of her. Marcus Johnson, Johnson Motors. Her encounter with Marcus had left her shaken, but also curious. His calm, steady demeanor haunted her thoughts, contrasting starkly with her usual world of superficial connections and relentless ambition. She reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number she needed. With a deep breath, she dialed. The modest neighborhood looked different in the morning light. The streets were alive with the hum of everyday life, kids heading to school, shopkeepers setting up for the day, and the occasional honk of a car horn. Emily pulled up to Johnson's auto repair and hesitated before stepping out of her car. This wasn't her world. But then again, maybe that was the point. The shop door jingled as she entered. Marcus was standing behind the counter, going over paperwork with another mechanic. He looked up, his expression a mixture of curiosity and mild surprise. "Miss Peterson," he said, setting the papers aside. "I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon." Emily fidgeted with the strap of her purse. "I was wondering if you had a moment to talk." Marcus gestured toward a small table in the corner.
Sure. Take a seat.
She sat down, feeling oddly out of place in her designer outfit amidst the grease-stained walls and the faint smell of motor oil. Marcus joined her, his calm presence both reassuring and unsettling. "What's on your mind?" he asked. Emily hesitated, searching for the right words. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how I didn't want to know." She paused, meeting his gaze. "You were right. I didn't want to know. But now I do." Marcus leaned back slightly, studying her. "And what do you want to know?" She bit her lip, a rare show of vulnerability. "How you do it. How you manage to stay grounded. How you find meaning in what you do." Marcus smiled faintly, as if the answer were both simple and complex. "It's not about managing, Miss Peterson. It's about perspective. I've learned that what matters most isn't what you have, but what you give. Success isn't just about climbing a ladder. It's about reaching back to help others climb, too." His words hit her like a freight train. She thought about her foundation, her gala events, her carefully curated image of philanthropy. Had any of it ever really been about helping others? "I don't think I've ever thought about it that way," she admitted. Marcus nodded. "It's never too late to start." Over the next few weeks, Emily found herself drawn back to the shop. She told herself it was to learn more about the neighborhood, to understand the people Marcus spoke of with such respect. But the truth was deeper. Each visit revealed layers of a world she had never cared to notice before. She met customers who spoke about Marcus with genuine gratitude, single mothers whose cars he had fixed at reduced rates, elderly men who came to the shop just for the company, and young mechanics he mentored with patience and wisdom. One afternoon, she found herself sitting outside the shop, watching a group of kids playing basketball on a makeshift court. Marcus joined her, holding 2 bottles of water. "You've been spending a lot of time here," he observed, handing her one of the bottles. She took it, her lips curling into a small smile. "It's different, but in a good way." Marcus glanced at the kids, a soft smile on his face. "This neighborhood has its challenges, but it's full of good people. They've taught me more than I could ever repay." Emily looked at him, her curiosity growing. "Was it always like this for you? Did you always see the world this way?" Marcus's smile faded slightly, replaced by a thoughtful expression.
No.
"I had my struggles, my mistakes. There was a time when I thought success meant leaving all of this behind. But life has a way of teaching you what really matters." She hesitated before asking, "Was that when my family's company was involved?" His jaw tightened slightly, but his tone remained calm.
Yes.
"They made decisions that hurt a lot of people, including my family. But holding on to anger doesn't build anything. So I chose to focus on what I could do instead of what they took." Emily's chest tightened with guilt. She had never been involved in the day-to-day decisions of her family's business, but she couldn't deny the responsibility. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Marcus looked at her, his expression softening.
I appreciate that.
But what matters is what you do now. That night, Emily returned to her sprawling estate. She stood in front of her ornate mirror, studying her reflection. For the first time, the image staring back at her felt hollow. She thought about the people she had met, the stories she had heard, and the man who had opened her eyes to a different way of living. She picked up her phone and began drafting an email. It was time to make changes, not for appearances, but for substance. When she finally went to bed, there was a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. The next morning, she returned to the shop, this time carrying a folder. Marcus raised an eyebrow as she handed it to him. "What's this?" he asked.
A proposal, she said, for a partnership.
"I want to help fund some of the initiatives you've been working on, scholarships, community programs, whatever you think is most important." Marcus opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. When he looked up, there was a hint of surprise in his usually calm demeanor. "Why?" he asked simply. Emily met his gaze, her voice steady. "Because I've spent my whole life looking down on people like you, and I was wrong. It's time I started doing something right." For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. Then he extended his hand. "Let's make it happen." As their hands shook, Emily felt a sense of purpose she had never known. For the first time, she wasn't chasing status or recognition. She was chasing something real. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Emily stood at the edge of a newly renovated community center, its fresh paint and vibrant murals a testament to months of effort and collaboration. The center was bustling with activity, kids laughing as they played basketball, parents chatting as they watched, and volunteers organizing donated books and supplies inside. She took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. The Peterson Foundation, in partnership with Marcus Johnson and Johnson Motors, had funded the renovation. But this was more than just a donation. It was the beginning of a transformation, not only for the community, but for Emily herself. "Looks good, doesn't it?" She turned to see Marcus approaching, his hands in his pockets and his usual calm smile in place. "It does," Emily replied, her voice soft. "I can't believe how much has changed." Marcus nodded, his gaze sweeping over the lively scene. "It's amazing what people can do when they come together." Emily smiled, her chest swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. "I owe a lot of that to you. I wouldn't have even considered this a year ago." Marcus chuckled. "You would have gotten here eventually. Sometimes it just takes the right nudge." Inside the community center, a small ceremony was about to begin. Emily and Marcus took their seats in the front row as a young woman stepped up to the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "My name is Gina, and I just want to say a few words on behalf of the community." Emily recognized her immediately, the woman who had brought cookies to Marcus's shop. Gina's son, Leo, was sitting proudly in the second row, beaming up at his mother. "This center means so much to us," Gina continued. "It's a place where our kids can learn and play safely, where families can find support, and where we can all come together. And none of it would have been possible without the generosity of the Peterson Foundation and Mr. Marcus Johnson." Applause filled the room, but Emily barely noticed. She was too busy watching Gina's face, seeing the genuine emotion in her words. It struck her that this was the first time in her life she felt truly connected to the impact of her wealth. After the ceremony, Emily and Marcus lingered near the refreshments table, accepting thanks from community members. A middle-aged man approached them, his handshake firm and his eyes bright with gratitude. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "This place is going to change lives. You've given us hope." Emily felt her throat tighten. She nodded, managing a small thank you in return. As the man walked away, she turned to Marcus. "This feels different. Better. I've done charity work before, but it never felt like this." "That's because you're here," Marcus said simply. "You're not just writing a check. You're part of the process. That makes all the difference." Emily nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "I think I finally understand what you meant. About substance over appearances." Marcus smiled. "Took you long enough." She laughed, shaking her head. "I suppose I deserved that. As the night wound down, Emily stood outside the center, watching the last few families leave. Marcus joined her, the quiet settling comfortably between them. "So," he said after a moment, "what's next for Emily Peterson?" She thought for a moment, the question lingering in the air. "I don't know," she admitted. "But for the first time, I'm okay with that. I think I'll just keep going. One step at a time." Marcus nodded approvingly. "That's a good plan." She turned to him, her smile genuine. "What about you? What's next for Marcus Johnson?"
"Same as always," he said.
"Working hard, helping where I can, and maybe teaching a few more people about patience and humility along the way." Emily smirked. "You've got your work cut out for you." "I'm used to it," he replied with a grin. The drive home felt lighter than ever before. Emily rolled down the window, letting the cool night air fill the car. She glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, noticing something she hadn't seen in a long time, a sense of peace. For years, she had measured her worth by the weight of her wallet and the power of her name. But now, she realized that true value wasn't about wealth or status. It was about connection, purpose, and the impact she could make on others. Marcus had been right. Change wasn't about words, it was about actions. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Emily felt ready to face it, one step at a time. For the first time, her world wasn't just about her. And that made all the difference.